Chapter 27, The Politics of Normalcy. This covers the three presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All three were Republicans. Remember, this is right after World War I got done. When Wilson ends his presidency, we see this sort of conservatism take over the United States. People were scared. We got back from Europe. We saw what the destruction of World War I could do, and everything sort of contracted. We saw it with the Red Scare when they were trying to round up subversives, right? Those are people who they consider dangerous to the state. These presidents are the embodiment of that conservatism, that's a hard word to say, that we see during the 1920s, that we don't always associate with the Roaring 20s. Now, Warren G. Harding was the president first. His goal was to reduce federal spending and to lower taxes. He did just that. He was very prominent in reducing the armaments, meaning weapons, in Europe. However, he was involved with the Teapot Dome scandal, which is realistically his Secretary of Interior, a man named Robert Fall, which is slightly ironic, who basically gave oil reserves in Wyoming, Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and two other locations in California to oil contractors for minimal bids. Actually, he really didn't go through the bidding process. This was scandalous. And Harding really sort of suffered from this. He does open the White House to tours, which people really enjoyed. And while on a tour out west, he was also one of the first presidents to go to Alaska. He dies while in office. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who is often known as Silent Cal, took over for Harding. He does get reelected, and he continues the reducing of taxes. He was very instrumental in implementing, meaning starting, the Dawes Plan. Now, the Dawes Plan set up a process for Germany to repay its war debts, because it started paying them and then all of a sudden it stopped. It was as soon as the economy kind of tanked and went down, Germany stopped repaying its war debts. So they set up sort of like installment plans and a process for Germany to do that. Remember, Germany does end up repaying all of its World War I debts by 2010. That's how long it took. He's also instrumental in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which he and Harding both worked out with France. It basically outlaws war. That's the goal of it. We don't want to have a war again. We don't want to have a world war again. We are going to outlaw war. When Coolidge decides not to run again for president, Herbert Hoover, who actually served under Wilson, he also served under Harding. He was instrumental in providing food to Europeans, and he served in Calvin Coolidge's administration, is elected president. Again, one president Republican, two president Republican, three president Republican. We've got about 9 years here or more. The policy of non-intervention in Central America, unlike Harding and Coolidge, who sent troops down to Nicaragua, who got involved in other disputes, who were trying to maintain American interests, he says no more. We're done. We got to take care of our own, and we got to get out of Central America. He writes a book about his experience feeding the Europeans in post-World War I Europe, called American Individualism, and he talks about the spirit of the Americans and how we're rugged, pull each other up by the bootstraps. Now, this is going to be becoming very important because of what's going to happen later on in his presidency. He promotes free enterprise. Now, that's a huge thing. If you're going to write down three things, you should have something about the Teapot Dome scandal. You should have something about the Dawes Plan. You should have something about the Kellogg-Briand Act. And what is free enterprise? Remember, he really promotes free enterprise, private ownership of corporations. He wants to have competition. When the economy fails in 1929 and the stock market crashes, he really thinks that the economy is going to turn itself around. All right. Big businesses boom during these three presidents. The post-war recession, where we saw basically owners having the upper hand with workers, telling workers that they were going to reduce their salaries of union workers, and the workers walking out and staging these protests and these strikes. And then we saw anarchists getting involved too. That's going to fade. Production is going to go up. Henry Ford and his assembly line come through for us again. The cars become the possessions of half of Americans. That's huge. With the assembly line, Henry Ford is able to make its Model T in 1908 for $950. That's over on that left-hand side of your screen. By 1926, he can make the same car for $290. So the car becomes the tool, not just of the wealthy, but the average American. That means I can get a job a little further away from my house. That's so cool. Businesses start to consolidate and merge together. We see that sometimes gets a little dicey because, remember, we fought that during the 1900s with the Antitrust Act and Teddy Roosevelt. But all in all, we see this big business is good because there's more employment, which means I have more ready cash, which means I can spend more. If I spend more, that means I need more people to make stuff, which means I need to hire more people. It's that circle of consumerism that we talked about in the first thing. Speculators start to really sort of put money out there for big products, hoping sort of to get rich quick. We see land booms in Florida. We're going to look at the next slide, which is Ponzi schemes. We see average Americans over here on the right-hand side investing in the stock market. And this is coming out in like ladies magazines. Hey, ladies, if you invest $15 a month in the stock market, you can have a massive payout in 20 years. Whoa, who doesn't want that? Everybody wants to be able to make some money, especially if times are good. Check out the Ponzi scheme. Beware, because they still exist. We see them happening on a day-to-day basis, even in large-scale corporate America today. Times aren't great for everybody. That's the one thing we got to remember. The Roaring 20s didn't roar for all groups. Farmers, farm workers, and unskilled workers suffer the most. We talked about farmers last time. There were surplus crops. Now, surplus means I had too many crops. Now, think economy, the law of supply and demand. If you have too much of a product, the value of that product goes down. Think Tickle Me Elmos. Nobody wanted Tickle Me Elmos when they were a dime a dozen. That's literally what that expression means. So that means that they had lower prices coming in, and a lot of them even just burned their crops because it wasn't financially feasible to sell their products. Therefore, if farmers are suffering, the farm workers who are realistically on the lower end of the wage scale, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most. These are often immigrants or first-generation Americans, and they are going to be working in the worst conditions. Unskilled workers, coal mines suffer because we have a switch to natural gas. Textile workers, the people who make clothing, their new synthetic fabrics, which are lasting longer. We don't need like the weaving process that you did before. African Americans, of course, are going to suffer a lot because they're going to be the last hired because of discrimination. It doesn't matter whether you're in the North or the South. And they're going to be the first fired. And they're always going to be paid a lower wage than their other workers. And they're not going to be allowed in the union, so they don't get the same rights. So this basically sums up the Republican 1920s our three presidents, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge,